Welcome again to the Master Coaches Wednesday Weekly Buzz. I'm Bob Bertucci, and I'm joined by fellow Master Coaches Mick Haley, Tom Hilbert, Jim Stone, and Bill Walton. All right, our topic today is going to be Who's in the Field of 64, second edition. So I thought we did pretty good on our first edition, though I know in the conferences I was covering, there was two teams that, one team that was definitely an upset. We still have two teams that haven't decided yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go by one master coach at a time, going over the conferences that they have assigned. And I'm going to start with Mick Haley. Mick, why don't you go ahead and talk about your non-Power 5 conferences first, if you would.
All right. I believe I've got these right, Bob. Thank you. My first conference, I believe, is the Missouri Valley Conference. And there's a situation there where University of Northern Iowa is in command. They're going to be in the tournament. The only way that conference gets two teams, I believe, is if Drake upsets them and gets the automatic bid. Then we would have two teams from that tournament. I don't believe Drake can get in on its own, but I have them as a bubble later. The second conference that I have is the Southern Conference, and Walford upset Citadel in that conference, so they'll be the single bid there. The Southland Conference had a great conference tournament, some really great games. Southeastern Louisiana came out on top. They like to be called Southeastern. And they will be the only team coming out of the Southland Conference. And the SWAC gets one team, and that will be Jacksonville State. So those are the conferences that are one bid conference. Now, I have another conference, the Sun Belt, which probably has snuck in under everybody's radar. But the one team that is not ranked in the top 50 is Coastal Carolina, and they were able to win that tournament. There are three other teams that absolutely should be in the tournament, and it's going to be interesting to see if the committee will follow through on their efforts. But the first one is JMC, James Madison. They have a ranking somewhere around 25 or 26 in the RPI. Pretty close to that in the API. The second one is USA, University of South Alabama. They're ranked in the below 40, I believe, about 38. And then Texas State is ranked either 40 or 42, depending on what's happening there. So those three teams plus Coastal Carolina should get into the tournament by the metrics. Now, what the committee selects, I don't know, Bob, but those are my conferences.
So it sounds like you have maybe 4 or 5 bubble teams that we'll talk about in a little bit.
I don't know about 4 or 5 bubble teams, but yeah, we can talk about it.
All right. Now, Jim, how about you give us your conferences in the teams?
Yeah, I have Pac-12 and Big Ten, which we'll talk about later. And that leaves me with 4 mid-major conferences, which I think will all be one-bid conferences. The MAC was won by Western Michigan, and I can't see another team getting in from the MAC, Mid-America Conference. The Horizon, Wright State won it, and they were favored to win it. And again, I don't see anybody else getting in. Ohio Valley plays today. Eastern Illinois is ranked in the 70s, KPI and RPI. They should win it. And again, if they're playing Southeast Missouri, who's ranked in the 150s. So I think it's a stretch for any more than one team from the Ohio Valley getting in. And then the Summit was decided last night, where Omaha, I guess you would consider an upset, beat Kansas City. And Kansas City is in the 120s or higher in the ranking. So That's going to be, I believe, a one bid conference. So other than the Pac-12 and Big Ten, all the ones I'm looking at, I think are just going to be one bid conferences.
All right, now Ohio Valley, Jim, who did you have winning that one? Because we want to go ahead and take your best pick there.
Well, Eastern Illinois is probably the favorite to win it.
Okay.
They play Southeast Missouri.
All right, Bill, let's go to you and hear about your conferences.
All righty, here I am. Hello, everybody, from 31-degree Grand Rapids. Just want everybody to know that this is a hooded, down-filled experience for William, because he's been at 85 degrees for the last 30 years, so I'm here shivering through my skin. So here's my report today. The American Athletic Conference, the AAC, SMU, RPI 25, they're the automatic qualifier. So we'll see SMU. Rice is in the hunt for a bubble team at RPI 58, but chances are pretty slim for Rice. They've got a couple of good victories, non-conference, but Rice is probably, they need to be saying their rosaries at home to have a chance. Conference USA, Western Kentucky, WKU, they're the automatic qualifier with an RPI of 20. They defeated New Mexico State in their conference tournament. The A-Sun, Florida Gulf Coast is the automatic qualifier. They beat Lipscomb. Lipscomb, no chance for the tournament. They have a poor RPI. Florida Gulf Coast is sitting at a 51, so they might have been a bubble team had they lost, but they won. So Florida Gulf Coast is the automatic qualifier. The Colonial, Delaware, beat Townsend. Delaware with a 59 RPI. Probably wouldn't have gotten into the tournament without a victory. So Delaware is the Colonial automatic qualifier. And then from the Big South, we've got High Point. High Point's an automatic qualifier. They're sitting with an RPI of 50. And if I'm not mistaken, I think High Point played Pepperdine. TCU. They played TCU in a non-conference late season match here in November. And I think that was set up ahead of time. It was smart of TCU to do, because TCU, they're not in our discussion yet, but TCU will need a win against a top 50 team if they got a hope of getting in as a bubble team. So those are my automatic qualifiers. SMU, Florida Gulf Coast, High Point, Delaware, and Western Kentucky University.
All right, thanks, Bill. And Tom, I know you hate the term mid-major, and you have 5 conferences you're reporting on, and I wouldn't even consider them mid-major. They're just good volleyball conferences. So why don't you go ahead and go over what you have and any bubble teams that you might have?
I will, but I want to throw out to Bill that, I had to come in from the swim up bar today and get rid of my pina colada before I could come in here and do this show. But
well, he's really rubbing it in today. Bill.
I'm going to start with 2 conferences that are probably decided. And, one is the WAC. And the WAC had a big upset in their tournament. Grand Canyon and Tim Nolan beat Stephen F. Austin, who had been undefeated going into that. And and Stephen F. Austin's RPI is good. I don't think they're a bubble team. I think they're in the 30s. And so I think the WAC's going to get 2 teams in because of that upset by Grand Canyon. So, I talked to Tim and he said their team just did a really good job of handling Stephen F's middles, and that was the difference, and they were able to defend them. The West Coast Conference does not have a tournament, and Pepperdine is the AQ, and Pepperdine is, I don't think anyone else is close enough to be a bubble team there. They have a match against SMU, which will only help them if they end up winning that. And then you have the Big Sky. Sac State had been leading that conference, and they're still in first place. They did lose their last 2 conference matches, one of them to Portland State. The Big Sky is a 1-bid league, and they have a tournament. The tournament is at Northern Colorado, and Northern Colorado is the second place team. And I think they've got a lot of momentum. Northern Colorado and Montana State have had the best finishes in that conference. And I think Weber State has an outside chance, but one of those four, I believe, will win that tournament, and they will be the only team to go from the Big Sky to the NCAA. The Big West, who has a tournament for the first time starting tonight. It's seeded. UCSB they're in the tournament, they're in the NCAA, whether they win their tournament or not. After that, I don't think anybody else is. So, the tournament is at Long Beach State, which is interesting. They're in second place. Hawaii and Cal Poly are tied for third. I think any of those four teams could win that tournament. If one of the other three wins it, then the Big West is a 2-team league. And then lastly, I want to talk about the Mountain West. And the Mountain West, Utah State has had a great year. They're 15-1. They go into their tournament, which starts tonight. They have a bye. And they are sitting at 16, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later, in the RPI, but their KPI dropped down to 21. They are, the odds-on favorite to win that Mountain West tournament, but it's really interesting. The other teams in that, there was a big cluster of teams fighting for even qualification to the tournament as of last week. Colorado State ended up winning 2 against 2 teams that were also in that cluster. So they are now solidly in second place with 6 losses. So they are the other team with a bye. And I think there's a lot of teams that could win that tournament. The tournament's at UNLV, and UNLV is a good team. They've got an unbelievable outside hitter from Germany. I just think there's like 4 teams that could win that tournament, but Utah State is in regardless. So that could be a 2-team league or 2-bid league. And it could be a 1-bid league. So that's where we're sitting on those 5 conferences.
So Tom, it sounds like you have a couple of fights on your hand come round 3 here, because you're going to have to pick some of these, your best pick for a conference, and then fight for the other teams you think might get in as an at-large bid.
Okay.
It's going to be a little different, I think. In my case, I have most of the East Coast conferences, and most of these conferences are 1-bid automatic qualifier conferences. For example, America East, UMBC, is the conference winner, and they needed probably to win to be able to get in, and they did. On the other hand, the Atlantic 10, we have Dayton as the winner, but there is Loyola Chicago that is a really good team. They're going to be on the bubble. They have a 49 RPI and a 67 KPI. So it's going to be tough for them. They really needed to upset Dayton, and Dayton would have probably gotten in. And that, as far as I know, that would have been the first time an A10 conference had more than one team in the tournament. But we'll see when we get to round 3. Big East hasn't been decided yet, same as some of the conferences Tom had. They're playing this weekend. But really, I think it's going to come down to Marquette and Creighton, and it's at Marquette. And I think both of those teams are going to get in, and that's going to be, a fight for me on round 3. Ivy League, the top team was Yale, and they won their conference. Same thing with Metro Atlantic. Fairfield was the number 1 team there, and they won their conference. The MEAC was won by Compton State, and that's the only team that's going to qualify out of that conference. In the Northeast, we had a little bit of an upset. The 4th place team, LIU, ended up beating Sacred Heart in the semifinals and going on to beat FDU in the finals. So they're going to be representing the Northeast Conference, the NEC, and that's the only team that's going to get in from that conference. And another old conference of mine was the Patriot League, and Colgate ended up winning that. They had a pretty good RPI and KPI, but they needed to win to be able to get in, and they did. So that kind of wraps up the teams and conferences I had. Mick, let's go back to you, and why don't we go ahead and, I know you had a couple of Power 5 conferences. Why don't we go ahead and discuss your Power 5 conferences?
Yeah, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I have the ACC and the SEC. Is that right?
No, the Big 12 and the SEC.
Okay. All right. So the Big 12 is interesting. I believe 6 teams are in. I believe there's a possibility of 3 more teams being on the bubble who could get in. So I'll tell you who I think the top teams are. Right now, Texas has won that conference at 16-1. Kansas seems to be second, with BYU third and University of Houston fourth. Kansas State is fifth, but I believe they're a bubble team. On the RPI, they're 57. On the KPI, they're 42. And in sixth place, Iowa State, I believe they're already in. Their RPI at 31 and KPI at 35 gets them in. Baylor is sixth, actually seventh in the conference right now with a 9-8 record, but they're already in with 36 and 36 in the RPI and KPI rankings. And then the team that I think is not going to get, I'm sorry, there's 2 more teams. There are actually 9 teams in contention. The team I think is not going to get in is the 8th place team, University of Central Florida. They are finishing up the conference. They're 8-8 right now. They have a 67 and a 57 ranking in the RPI and the KPI. I think they will not make it. TCU really helped themselves last night, as Bill pointed out. They played High Point and won 3-0, and that kind of jumped them up in the KPI to 42, the RPI to 46. So they're in a bubble position, assuming that all of Tom's conferences don't do funny things and end up with 2 teams each. They've got a chance to get in. So I think there's 6 definite: Texas, Kansas, BYU, Houston, Iowa State, and Baylor. I think TCU is the next team to, yes, I believe TCU is the next team to get in, even though they are 9th in the conference. Kansas State, I don't know how Kansas State is going to get in. They're the real question mark of the 3 teams, and I think UCF is not.
Okay, let me stop you there for a second, Mick.
Yeah.
And maybe we can pull up the ones that we know are automatic qualifiers right now and see where we're at and what our number is looking at our automatic qualifiers, because it sounds like you got a lot of things to talk about with that Big 12.
So what do you want me to say? The same thing again?
No, I'm just giving our viewers a chance to look at our automatic qualifiers that have come in. And I'm looking to see if we have the Big 12
Texas
up there. We have Texas on there. So
All
Texas, we know is for sure. All right. Okay. So how about now looking at the next? You said there was 4 teams for sure besides Texas that you think are in, or 3 teams.
No,
sure?
I think 5 teams besides Texas are in for sure. I think.
Which one has the lowest RPI and KPI? And see if there's any argument with any of our other master coaches.
Well, Kansas is 14 and 14 in the RPI and KPI. BYU is 15 and 15. And today it might be off 1 point or so, but if you use the big stats, you'll get a little variation. But these are pretty accurate figures. U of H is 16 and 30. That's the biggest variance of any of the teams there. But even if you're under 30, you're going to get in. So those 3 teams. Iowa State is 31 and 35, 9 and 7 in the conference. They're 6th right now. So I think that would be your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th team. And then Baylor is 36 and 36. They're 7th in the conference, but I think those 6 teams are in. I don't think there's any debate over that, but you can ask everybody what
Okay,
they.
anyone else have any question or debate on that?
No, there's no debate on that.
No,
My
I
only
agree.
question, my only question is, K-State had a big win against, who did they beat, Texas?
Texas.
So do you, K-State at Texas gets them in over TCU? Because TCU upped their RPI by playing High Point, and K-State's, and I don't think beating High Point helps you get in the tournament. It might help your RPI, but I don't think it helps you get in the tournament. Do you think?
Well, High
K-State's
Point won their
bigger?
conference. That's why it helps.
Well, it helps your RPI, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help people believe that you're better than K-State.
Well, I think that's
Who's head to head? K-State and TCU. Who won? Do you know?
no, I don't know. I really feel that at least one of those teams will get in.
Okay, so is it fair to say that the 6 teams, counting Texas, everybody agrees with? Why don't you go over those one more time, Mick?
Texas, Kansas, BYU, University of Houston, Iowa State, and Baylor.
Okay, we'll keep the other ones to round 3 then.
Just throw this in: Kansas State and TCU split.
Yeah,
Ah,
good get,
so
Tom.
so it's a toss-up.
All right, Mick, go to your next Power 5 conference, the SEC.
Ooh, SEC.
SEC has been very interesting. So the matches this weekend, get this, the matches this weekend are Kentucky versus Arkansas, Arkansas versus Auburn, Kentucky versus Florida, all in that conference. And Florida State, who's in first place in the conference. No, I'm sorry, that's the ACC. And so that's going to make a difference really in the front part of the league. Right now, Kentucky and Tennessee are battling for first in the conference with Arkansas. One's 15-1, the other one's 14-2, 14-2. All 3 of those are in the tournament, and they're the only 3. One of those 3 teams is going to win the conference. So all 3 of them are in. Their RPIs and KPIs are all below 15 of all 3 teams.
So we got Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee. We know from the SEC are in, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about the next group as we get into this next round. So let's move to Jim.
well,
Jim
we
has-
think Auburn.
Whoa,
Bob, there are more
whoa.
teams that are in.
There's
in
more
the
teams.
SEC.
Oh, okay. Let's go then. All right, Bill, stop me. You put the stop up.
Whoa. Someone turn off East Coast Boy.
All right, the fourth team that's in is Florida. They have both RPI and KPIs under 20, but they're 9-7 in the conference. But there's no question that they're going to get in. So those 4 teams. The 5th team is Auburn. They have RPI and KPI rankings of under 30. So my feeling is that they're in for sure. Then the very interesting ones are Missouri, Georgia, and Texas A&M. And while Georgia is a real bubble team at 54 and 45 in the KPI and RPI rankings, Texas A&M at 28 and 26 is under 30, and I presume will be in the tournament with those kinds of ratings. I just don't see how they're not in the selection, even though they're 8th in the conference. The outside team, like I said, is Georgia on the bubble, but Missouri has got a 32 RPI and a 41 KPI, and they're 6th in the conference. And I think Missouri gets in also. So I see the SEC with 7 teams in and Georgia on the bubble.
So you're looking at 7 teams from the SEC?
I sure am.
That's never happened before.
I think it has actually.
Well, and three of them will be in the.
So there.
3 of them will be hosting the
Yeah.
first weekend. 3 of them will be in. 3 of them will be seated in the top 16. Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee.
I think
In the top
Bill, that's
16.
true if they perform this weekend. But Arkansas has Auburn, and Arkansas has Kentucky, and Florida has Kentucky. So it could be Arkansas needs to do well, I think.
Well, Arkansas can't lose to Auburn. And whatever happens with Kentucky won't knock them out of the top 16. But if they lose to Auburn, that could knock them out of the top 16.
Possibly, yeah.
Because I have them sitting right now at 15 on the bracket. So
Okay, anybody disagree with Mick going down to, what was it, 7 deep
7
in the
deep.
SEC?
7 plus 1 on the bubble, Bob.
All right. Tom?
I've got Sunbelt too. Did I give you Sunbelt already?
You did.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go for it. Go,
I
Bob.
don't disagree with Mick, and I think the SEC it's interesting because you've got some teams in there that have not been great in conference play, but their RPIs are still really strong, and historically the committee has let those teams in.
They have.
Jim, you feel the same way?
No question. I would never disagree with Mick. No,
All right, well,
I think
well,
it's.
with that being said,
Don't forget, Jim.
then why
Stone
don't you
and I-
pick up the Big Ten?
Well, I had I had both the Big Ten and the Pac-12. But before I start talking about those teams, I mean, I'm into the metrics and all that, but I got a question for you master coaches. At what point do the eyes take over? And people looking at these teams, the committee members looking at these teams and go, I get it, that team is in the 50s or whatever, but man, are they playing good right now? Or do we just go by RPI, KPI? And I'll ask this other question, then people can respond. What's the relevance between wins and losses week 1, week 2? And will those carry you through the season or kill your season for the next 10 weeks? So I asked both those questions with the idea of there's teams in the Big Ten and the Pac-12 that I think are playing better than their KPI or RPI would indicate they should be playing. So I mean, so before we talk specific teams, are there any insights that people might have about the relevance of the eyes versus the metrics? And then part 2, if somebody lost the first weekend, does that put a stake in their heart for the rest of the year?
You know, it's been my experience that the committee has chosen to use that to their advantage. If they want somebody in the tournament and they had early wins, they use that as a parameter to pick them. And if there's somebody they feel shouldn't be in the tournament that has early wins, they say, well, that was the first part of the season. That doesn't really count now. That really has been the way I felt that it's been used. Maybe that's not, maybe it hasn't been used that way on purpose, but it just seems like it has worked out that way. I'm interested to see what you come up with the one team that has their only big early win in the first 2 weeks and hadn't beaten anybody of consequence since. So we'll see how you put them when you go to bat here.
Well,
Yeah, fair
Jim,
enough.
Jim,
well-
I think that you're actually asking a good question, but unfortunately, I think that the tournament's mission is to have a large body for representation and not necessarily all the time. And they try and balance out having a nationwide representation by conference while at the same time trying to have the top teams that could win the tournament. And so I think when you get right down to picking someone who's not going to win the tournament and picking between a sixth place team in the Big Ten or a second place team from the WAC, they, I think, are sometimes looking at how a team played at the end, and and do we do representation, and then of course you got to take into geography because they're doing things by pods now. So if you're tied with somebody but you can fit in a bracket better, you might get into the tournament because you're geographically more easily located. So there's too many things to consider other than how you did. I mean, look at Loyola Chicago. 2 of their wins. They beat Purdue the first weekend, but haven't beaten anybody since. And now they're second place in the conference. Do they get in because they've got 2 top 16 victories the first weekend of the season? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, to me, the metrics should be kind of tiebreakers with teams that are close versus that's our first criteria.
Right. But I think the committee uses it. They sort of have a CYA mentality with it. When it gets anything close, they're going to go and say, these are the numbers in the KPI and RPI. And they'll, because they can, that's not subjective, it's objective according to the computer. So they'll use it.
Yeah.
The other thing, Jim, is that the coaches, there's no coaches on this committee. So they really don't necessarily possess the depth of knowledge that we would think as coaches that goes into our thinking, correct? So what else can they use?
Yeah, and I get the pluses and minuses of having administrative staff versus coaches or vice versa. So there's some pluses and minuses there, but I'll tell you why I ask it'll become apparent why I ask as I go through both these conferences. First, the Big Ten. I think you have 4 for sure teams: Nebraska, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Penn State. After that, yeah, I mean, it gets to what I was alluding to. You have Minnesota that has bad losses to Maryland and Rutgers, for crying out loud. Now, will the committee weigh that heavier than they beat Oregon, I think the first or second weekend?
Second weekend, I think.
And then they've also beaten TCU and Baylor, which are lesser quality, but still quality wins. So they started out, okay, we beat Oregon. And I thought the middle, almost 2/3 of their season was a borderline train wreck. But I watched them last weekend, last couple weekends, and they're trending up, so it goes back to one of the questions I asked is I'm looking at Minnesota now and going, okay, that's the team everybody expected. But also that's a team that is, what are they? 54 in KPI and 43 in RPI, so I guess you would think they're a bubble team. But they play Illinois and Nebraska this weekend, so losing to Nebraska isn't a deal breaker. Losing to Illinois, then that becomes a problem for them, I would think. But then there's Illinois, who's in the 80s someplace on both KPI and RPI, and I've watched them the last couple of weeks, and they're playing well. So. I think if coaches are on that committee, they're going to give weight to that. If administrators are with administrators being on the committee, who knows how much weight they give to it. So Minnesota, I think, would be the bubble team out of the Big Ten. The other 3 teams that people are clamoring about are IU, Northwestern, and Illinois. And I just don't see it. I think there's too many losses and not enough wins. I mean, Illinois has beat Purdue recently. but they've lost to Ohio State, who's 108. They've lost to Indiana. They've lost to Central Florida. So they've got some losses that I'm sure they'd like to have back. They've lost to Notre Dame. But so I think the match between them and Illinois that's coming up, I mean, how much will that hurt Minnesota if they lose to Illinois, or versus how much will that help Illinois? And maybe it puts the kibosh on both of them. I don't know. So long story short, 4 teams out of the Big Ten, and generously Minnesota's a bubble team. And I think that's it, which is so atypical from the Big Ten.
Jim, I think Minnesota is in because I think the committee does sometimes consider injuries. And when they were a train wreck, their starting setter was out injured. And now that she's back, I hope they can see that they're playing differently now with her back at full strength. And they seem to be a completely different team. And I think with that 43 RPI, I think they bubble themselves in if they don't just get blown out 0-3 this weekend.
Yeah, and that could be the relevance that injuries have. Then you go back, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, when it comes down to seedings. You can't have one criteria for Minnesota and a second criteria for Wisconsin. You know, so but that's
or Florida.
Or Florida for sure.
Well, Florida
so
doesn't get that. Florida's not
later.
getting Stuckey back though, so the other two got their players back.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Pac-12, actually, some kind of a similar story. I think Stanford's in, Oregon's in, Arizona State's in, Washington State's in, and USC is in. USC has KPI RPI of 32 and 30. Skylar Fields is hurt. Whether that's, I don't think that'll make a difference with them getting the tournament. It might make a difference.
She has
Steve
COVID.
Did not play last night.
Yeah, she has
lost to
COVID.
Oregon. I'm sorry.
She has
She has
COVID.
COVID. Yeah.
Really, I saw her on the bench with a big boot on. So
They're telling everybody.
maybe
has
maybe
COVID.
Pfizer's come up with a new treatment for COVID. The bubble team that I see is UCLA, and they're 46 and 55 on the two rankings. They play USC this weekend, which I would think would be a big match for them. If they win, they might legitimately be a bubble team. If they lose, I just don't see them. Well, we'll keep them on the bubble. They beat Pepperdine. That's really kind of the only quality win that they've had. But again, I think they're playing better now than what they've been playing. So if that makes a case for their existence on the bubble. Colorado would be the next team, but they're 56 and 63. They play Cal and Utah this weekend, so it's not really going to help them that much. Washington, kind of a similar scenario. They play Washington State. They might, if they beat them, they might move up enough, but I don't think so. They're at 64, 65 right now. So that's the state of affairs with the Pac-12 and Big Ten.
Hey, Jim, just a speculation. How good would the NIT be this year if all those teams that aren't making it go to the NIT?
How good would it be, or how competitive would it be? I think it would be very competitive.
Yeah, well, you would have name schools in the NIT with a lot of moxie from the conferences. The question is, will the conferences allow them to go? Because the NIT could be a real nice secondary tournament building towards the next year if all the good teams that didn't make it but were up and coming, like you were saying, are playing well at the end of the season, jumped in there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good call. I mean, Indiana is trending up, but they just don't have enough going on with them right now. We mentioned Illinois, Northwestern. They're playing okay. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Whether teams will head that direction, or athletic departments will head that direction. Who knows?
Yeah, even Ohio State with a relatively young team.
Yeah, there's another one, right?
It would be a great learning experience for them. Well, Bill, are you ready? I know you got a couple of Power Fives here.
I got one Power Five, the
One Power
ACC.
Five. Yeah,
And
but it's a big
the ACC is now. So the first place team in the ACC is Florida State, but Florida State's got a 26 RPI, and the second place team in the ACC, Pitt, has a 3 RPI. The third place team has a 4 RPI, and the fourth place team has a 19. So the team that could end up winning the ACC is Florida State, and they have the lowest RPI of the 4 teams coming out. And Florida State's not playing it well. They could get upset, but chances are at the end of this weekend, Florida State's going to be sitting at 4-2, and if they're at 4-2 and they're tied with Pitt, I think they get the nod as the conference champion because they go by winning percentage. So
Yeah, they have to beat Notre Dame, right?
right, they have to beat Notre Dame. So anyway, that's just for the conference champion and top seeds. But anyway, I got the ACC going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 deep into the tournament.
Who's the 7?
Duke. They're at 45 RPI.
Don't you think they're bubble?
I think that's a bubble team.
Well, I think they're potentially a bubble team, but I think the strength of the ACC at the top drags in the bubble team at the bottom. I could be wrong, but I'm predicting them. And so I got Louisville, Pitt, Georgia Tech, Florida State, Miami, North Carolina State, and Duke is the bubble team that might make it or might not make it in. And I've got Louisville right now. Pitt's got the higher RPI, but I think Louisville's got the better resume than Pitt does. So I'm suggesting that Louisville ends up at the end of the weekend actually being the higher seeded team into the NCAA tournament, with Pitt followed by Georgia Tech and Florida State, Miami and North Carolina State as the for sure teams in, and Duke sitting on the bubble at 45.
Well, I could agree to 6 of those right now. I think I want to keep that one team on the bubble, Duke, and see how everybody else kind of, feels about that. Anybody else agree or disagree?
Well, Duke's got a victory over Creighton. So if Creighton ends up being second in their conference to Marquette by chance, then maybe you got to drag Duke into the tournament because you want to take Creighton into the tournament.
Well, Creighton's in the tournament.
Well, and Duke's got a victory over Creighton. So
I think Duke has a victory over NC State too, doesn't they?
They do.
Yeah.
So they've got and actually Coastal Carolina an automatic qualifier, I think.
Yeah, they won the Sun Belt.
Right. So they've got 3 victories over 3 teams going to the NCAA tournament. So I think they have a chance to get themselves into the bubble conversation at 45. It just depends. If there's no more upsets in the 5 conferences that still don't have their 8 Qs, if the top seeded teams get in, then I think Duke ends up getting in because of the strength of the ACC. My opinion. No facts on that. I think the only thing that hurts Duke is Duke has been traditionally not an NCAA team. So people aren't used to considering Duke as being always very good.
They've got a few weird losses too, but
they do.
Yeah,
they do. Yeah, you gotta take into consideration it's not just your good wins, but to quote the man in Mexico, who we all hate for this 1 hour. To quote the man in Mexico, you got to consider weird losses as much as you do good wins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think Tom, I think we're going into round 3 right now. So
yeah.
As Bill was talking about the bubble team, how about you discussing your bubble teams right now, and let's see how they fare with using Duke as our yardstick right now.
See, I really don't think I have any bubble teams. What I have is potential AQs that are not bubble teams but might win their tournaments. So that leaves you with a team like Stephen F. Austin, who I really don't think they're a bubble team.
Okay.
And
I would
so,
agree. I think they're in the tournament. I agree,
yeah,
Tom.
they're in the tournament. And I think, if Utah State were to lose the Mountain West tournament, they're still in. If UC Santa Barbara were to lose the Big West tournament, I think they're still in. So I think it's just going to come down to who wins these tournaments on Thursday and Friday. And I think people are going to have to sit back and wait. And that's, if you have these upset teams coming in and winning those, that's probably a nightmare for the NCAA championship committee, because then they're going to have to bump somebody who's got a pretty good RPI.
That takes UCLA, Minnesota, all these
Right.
teams that are right there on the bubble, maybe Duke. I mean, they're SOL because I mean, they're taking up space. Those leagues, that if they have upsets in each of those leagues, there's 3 spaces gone right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how about if there is upsets, then what you're saying is those 3 teams in those 3 conferences would still get in. What happens if they win? If the favored team in those conferences win, Tom, then are the other teams out?
I think in the Mountain West, they're a 1 bid. If Utah State wins the tournament, it's a 1 bid. I think it's same thing in the Big West, and same thing in the Big Sky.
Yep.
Big Sky's a 1-team league anyway. So, yeah.
And since we're talking about this, we can jump right to Mick's Sun Belt Conference. Is Texas State in, Mick?
I have them as a bubble, but I think they should be in. And I tell you, they got left out last year when they qualified, and they're better this year. Their numbers are better. So
aren't they in the 30s RPI?
They're 40 and 42.
Yeah. So
I took everybody over 40 as a bubble team, honestly.
So is the Sun Belt a 3 or 4 team conference this year? What's your call?
I'm afraid that the committee is going to look at it as a 3-team conference, but I think they've earned the right to have a 4-team conference. And I just, as I've done their television, I've watched all the matches and the coaches, and I think this is purposeful. The way they scheduled was purposeful. The teams they tried to play was purposeful. And so I think this is a conference that's trying to get some respect, and they hit a home run this year. Whether the committee will throw water on them or whether they'll reward them, I don't know. But I think they produced the numbers to be considered. I think they have less of a chance if the scenario that Tom talked about was if all those top teams get beat or upset and they get into the tournament anyway, and we lose 3 positions, there's very few. The committee is going to have to make some really hard decisions, I think.
Well, and then we add Jim's argument to this mix. If you've got Minnesota and Illinois from the Big Ten playing really good at the end of the year, but their numbers aren't great, but you like how they look, does the Sun Belt go to a 2-team conference and you eliminate some of those teams that Tom's talking about? Do they become 1-bid conferences because of the name of the Big Ten?
Well, that's what we want to see, isn't it? Isn't that what the committee is going to have to reveal themselves this year, because a lot of these conferences are putting a lot more money into women's volleyball, and if they get left out of the tournament, what's that going to say to the athletic director? Well, we never can get more than 1 team in the tournament, so why do I fund this over soccer or women's basketball or something else?
I kind of think at least in my eyes, one of the criteria for bubble teams is, have you beaten anybody above you? Now, maybe you've got some losses along the way, but we've beaten these teams that are ranked above us. And a lot of these bubble teams, I shouldn't say a lot because I haven't looked that close, but I know in the conferences that I have, we've beaten the other guys, but we haven't beaten anybody above us. And if I'm comparing bubble teams, to me, that would be a criteria. have you beat a ranked team? Have you beat a team that's 10, 20 spots above you in the KPI or RPIs? I think that's a criteria that's worth merit in my eyes.
Right, and if we go by Jim's criteria, you've got to put Georgia and K-State in on the bubble.
Yep. So how about, I don't know if you guys have done this or not, but how about if I can give you 9 teams that I think are bubble teams, and you can add others if you like, but if I throw out 9, would that help the discussion?
Well, we could probably vote yes or no right away.
So whoever, I forgot who was talking about the WCC, but I think LMU Marymount, not Loyola Chicago, LMU Marymount is actually a bubble team. They're real close in RPI, KPI, and they've challenged in that conference also. I think they're a bubble team. I think I've got a list here that I could throw out. I thought UCLA was a bubble team. I thought Georgia was a bubble team. There are 3 that I think are not to be considered, and that's UTEP, Wichita State, and Wake Forest. But people could make a case for that, but I'm not advocating for those 3. I had Kansas State as a bubble team. You mentioned Rice as a bubble team, but I think they're too far down. I didn't have them as a bubble team. I had TCU, though, as a bubble team, and Minnesota as a bubble team, and Miami and Duke and Texas State as bubble teams.
So I had Loyola Chicago as a bubble team with a 67 on the KPI, but a 49 on the RPI.
Why do you think there's such a great disparity there? UCLA's got the same kind of disparity.
I think that ends up being the scheduling. You get into the Atlantic 10 and you have a couple of teams in that Atlantic 10 conference that just have poor RPIs or KPIs. So it ends up hurting your schedule. So if you haven't scheduled real strong in the beginning.
Yeah, but that's not the question. The question is why the discrepancy between 2 PIs. So obviously it's scheduling, but why is scheduling help you in the RPI or the KPI and not help you in the other one retrospectively?
Well, my understanding is the KPI gives you greater weights for road wins. So
Right,
winning on the road is big. That's the only thing I know of that's different.
Yeah.
Well, it takes in consideration home and away, right?
Yeah.
Yes, it does take into consideration that it weights up, and it weights a road victory against a higher rated team gets you a little higher scoring KPI. So winning on the road against a bottom 100 team doesn't get you the same perks as winning against a top 50 team on the road in KPI.
When I see a disparity of 15 points between the 2 rankings, I'm worried. I have to really research those teams because there's something there that either got them a high ranking or got them a low ranking, right?
Yeah, and it isn't that common. Most of them sit within 5 or 6 spots of each other on most teams.
But there's a few outliers, and it would be interesting to get the Kevin Pogon and have him explain to us why his is different than the RPI and why the discrepancy, if he can actually tell us. But Mick, I've got some of the same ones. I've got Duke, TCU, LMU, Loyola Chicago, Drake, Georgia, UCLA, Colorado, and K-State as my 8 or 9 teams that are going to have to wait and see what the committee thinks about.
I felt like there was 6 spots. I felt if everything goes the way it's supposed to go and there's not upsets like you were talking about, Tom, I felt like there were 6 spots open. I could go up to 58 and pretty much guarantee 58 teams. But those next 6 spots, barring unforeseen happenings in these conference tournaments, that 6 of those teams could still get in.
So Mick, did you have Tom's conferences with the favorite team actually winning it, or did you?
That's what I was saying. Yes, if the favorite team wins, then I think there's 6 spots for the bubble teams. But any upsets reduces by upset. One for every upset that reduces 1 spot is what I think might be the case or close to the case.
Right. Which means that these last 5 or 6 conferences that are being decided tonight through Saturday night are going to have a big impact on the bubble, as they always do.
Well, I think the Big East, it doesn't really matter. Either one of those teams can win, I think, and they're both still going to get in. Marquette and Creighton.
I have them both in, though. I have them both in up to 58. Those are
Okay.
teams I already have in the 58.
Right. I have them in also.
But
let me ask a question. Do you guys think the Power 5 teams are given an advantage in the bubble team race? So, for example,
I think so for sure, Tom.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that takes teams like Texas State. That really makes it a hard road for them.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think
good.
the committee looks at your conference strength of schedule, and if your conference, no matter how much the Sun Belt has manipulated their scheduling to do a good job getting their top teams in good RPI position, then they're going to go over to that conference strength of schedule, and there's nothing they can do about their conference strength of schedule because of their bottom teams are so far down.
So we were talking about this the other day off the call. Jim, do you think because of the way the Big Ten is presenting volleyball and the crowds they're drawing, that their teams are going to get more consideration for the tournament because of the way they're being presented, both in the number of cameras and the crowds and the way? I mean, their presentation. Obviously, the Big Ten has outdone ESPN and everybody else in bringing women's volleyball to the people watching on TV, and the presentation is pretty fun for everybody. But does that give them an advantage in the selection, or will that have an effect on the committee in the selection? And should it have an effect? I guess that's the other thing. Should it have an effect for the committee to select more teams from that conference?
Yeah, when you're sitting watching a Big Ten match, your eye test with the sound, it just gives you the feeling that when there's a lot of excitement, that match seems more important and at a higher level than when you're in an empty gym.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple opinions on that. First of all, I think it does. I think it does make a difference, and whether it should or not, you can probably debate for the purposes of the teams we're looking at right now. You have Nebraska, Wisconsin, Purdue, Penn State that will all put on. They'll all host. I think they're all going to host, and they would all do a good job. So if I'm on the committee, that gives me kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling that this is going to be a good show. Where it might affect is Minnesota, and I'm listening to people talk, and and I don't have any teams to add for the bubble teams, but if TCU is a bubble team, Baylor is a bubble team, Oregon's in, but those are all teams that Minnesota beat. And again, it was early, but they beat them. So there's got to be some bonus points for that. So it's almost I'm making a case for moving Minnesota to a bigger, more audacious bubble. A very visible bubble, as opposed to kind of a one of the gang type of a bubble in situation. But then it goes back to Mick's point. Well, they're a bubble team. Maybe they're in, maybe they're not, but they're going to draw 5,000 people. Is that a deal breaker? One way or the other, I'm not sure, but I would hazard to think that it would be a consideration for sure. And it's almost conversely, you look at UCLA was mentioned as a bubble team for good reason. what are they, 46 and 55 on the rankings. But they've only beaten one other team that's even being talked about. So they're one of these teams that they've beaten everybody else, but they haven't jumped up and beaten a higher team. So that's why I think if they beat USC this weekend, they're in a much stronger position than they are as we sit here today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think they have to beat USC this weekend. Otherwise, I think they would be easy for the committee to eliminate, except that they're UCLA.
Yeah.
And they're coming to the Big Ten.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to think about these things. I'm sure the committee gets hit with these things. I mean, we're not the committee, but we're here having discussions like the committee is going to have, maybe or maybe not. And
I think that the committee would be well served to take the 5 master coaches show and have that as another criteria.
There you go. We'll pat ourselves on the back. There you go. That's right.
And
well,
Tom,
we know they're sitting
in the chair there. He's wiggling in the chair because he's lived how this committee makes these decisions.
Oh yeah,
and not being that Power 5 and being right there. Tom, comments from you on that?
Well, it was mentioned earlier that the Sun Belt was very deliberate in the way they scheduled. You know what I mean? And there are there are teams and coaches that get that. How to schedule, the type of team to schedule, successful teams that are going to be 20-win teams that you can beat. You know what I mean? And Utah State was able to do that. And it's helped them mathematically in the RPI. And I think that there's going to be a point where the NCAA Championship Committee will look at some of those mathematical sort of people that have used the math to get their RPI high and go, wait a minute, we may not want to. Minnesota should be in over some of these teams, for example, because they have quality wins, even though their mathematical number is not that high. I think that's going to happen at some point. It's happened in men's basketball before.
It's happened in volleyball too.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so
here's another question to throw out on that. So do you know what the reimbursement is for volleyball right now? Back to the teams, because the men's basketball, that's a big deal. The reason the small conferences go for basketball is the reimbursement back. That's a lot of money they get back for getting in the tournament.
Mm-hmm.
Are we looking at a situation in volleyball where there'll be a large reimbursement coming back from volleyball? Because now we're going to Sunday afternoon. We're putting 7,000 to 9,000 in the stands in the weekends. Small conferences could use the payback.
Yeah, there isn't one right now, but this Jamie Gordon and I had this conversation, and I think that it is possible that softball and volleyball may break out and have their own shares coming back. And I think that would be significantly important for our sport. It really would get AD's attention. There'd be all kinds of reasons to do that.
And of course, once that happens, how you select teams for the tournament even becomes more critical.
No doubt.
Yeah, and so you don't want to kick smaller conferences out of their fair share of teams. So it's kind of a darned if you do and darned if you don't, right? I mean, how do you know which way to go?
Well, I think with that note, Mick, we're going to leave our audience pondering that question.
In suspense.
In suspense. We'll go ahead and put up our picks for the 64 teams, the way we think it's most likely going to show up, and we're going to put that up on the website. Just a real quick announcement before we sign off for today. We do have the college transfer showcase being held down at the AVCA convention on Saturday, December 16th. So any athlete or any coaches watching that have athletes that are looking to transfer, make sure you go on our website. You can do registration on there and sign up for the showcase as soon as possible. Thanks until next Wednesday.